Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. It's been a long wait, but at long last I can say that we have got this new Behemoth album, Opvs Contra Natvram. Behemoth to me have been kind of stuck in a creative rut for quite a while now. Big fan of a lot of their output from the mid-2000s, like The Apostasy or Demigod. Definitely thought 2014's The Satanist was a creative peak. The Satanist is a pretty hard album to ignore, really refining the intense and sometimes niche black metal that Behemoth had been running with and really made it a lot more accessible. Very much a watershed moment. Everything kind of culminates there. And while I think it is one of their best, there is always the benefit of hindsight with an album like that. You could kind of take the angle that The Satanist was a creative peak and that this has since changed everything for this band. You could also view it as a Black Album moment where the band is now fundamentally sold out. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle in this case. I think the follow-up to The Satanist, 2018's I Loved You at Your Darkest, was maybe a little bit too transparent of an attempt at recapitalizing on the sounds and aesthetics of The Satanist, but with not nearly the same quality of writing, being mostly forgettable between tracks like God Equals Dog or We Are the Next 1000 Years, both of which are memorable to me because of their song titles. The tracks themselves are kind of a bore. But here on this new album, it feels at least like some of that more fresh, new energy is kind of being reignited. It is still very much a post-Satanist album, but this band has toured with Slipknot at this point. They are one of the biggest metal acts in the world, for better or for worse. So with this newer, sleeker approach to writing and production, they have kind of slowly started reincorporating elements from earlier releases and have also kind of started trying to bring more new ideas to the table. And what a lot of this album feels like to me is Behemoth kind of trying to reclaim their reputation past Nurgle, like posting photos of himself sucking toes on Twitter. And I know there's separating art from the artist, but Jesus Christ, man. Anyway, back on track, a lot of what is here is fairly solid material. There are points where the songs can end up feeling a little bit redundant or start feeling like maybe they put one too many 4-minute long tracks on this thing, but you know, it's okay because the pacing is at least pretty decent. And I think the thing that bothers me the most on this album is the same thing that has bothered me on every Behemoth album, and it's honestly the whole attitude being this kind of like a weak 14-year-old's take on life and nihilism and Satanism in general. Like, if you wanted more mature or developed and nuanced takes lyrically from Behemoth, that is still nowhere to be found on this album. Nurgle can and does write some very vivid, very intense lines with some gruesome imagery, but it always loops back to a point where I can't help but think of that scene from The Big Lebowski where Walter is telling the nihilists to like shut up and that he doesn't respect them. It really just feels like lyrics written from a place of weakness. Instrumentally, at least, there is no shortage of blast beats or chugging guitar parts, though a lot of it, while being pretty solid, doesn't really end up sticking out very much past a few decent guitar solos or some neat choices of effects. It seems like a lot of the instrumentals that end up being more forgettable, ironically, are the ones that try to overcorrect from that more accessible sound back into these very blast beat heavy black metal passages, whereas the more catchy stuff ends up being really solid, like pretty much all of the track Once Upon a Pale Horse. So it's kind of weird when you have Behemoth trying to sort of backpedal and not necessarily like return to their roots, but they are trying to kind of reincorporate or even reinvent the sounds that they based their catalog off of, and it's a shame because so many of these more extreme moments end up not necessarily falling flat, but definitely not reaching the lofty heights that they've set their sights on reaching. And on the other side of that, you've got these more modern, sleeker, catchier songs that you can tell they're trying to kind of maybe move away from, or at least are trying to rein in, and those tracks are generally the better songs here, or at least are more memorable, and both for good and bad reasons. Anyway, let's get into it track by track. The opening track, Post God Nirvana, is mostly an intro track that builds up to the next song, Malaria Vulgata. As the opening suite, they feel pretty cohesive together, but I am kind of shaking my head at this goofy opening track that sounds like a high-lung track, but with Nurgle roaring whatever the Eastern European equivalent of like We Was Kangs is. It's dramatic, but it's not exactly an explosive or particularly captivating start. Malaria Vulgata at least picks up that pace in a much more traditionally fast and like ripping black metal pace. It's one of the few times on the album that it feels like it helps instead of hinders things. But even still, as far as black metal goes, it's pretty mid. Like, they wanted to channel some of the same energy from like Dissection's Storm of the Lightsbane, but the closest they get is like a kind of a flimsy imitation. Deathless Sun definitely taps more into the huge, sweeping, anthemic stuff that they've been hitting on since The Satanist. Past the lyrics, this is actually a fairly good track, but I wish Nurgle would just quit fucking whining about how he's nothing. Of My Herculean Exile is one of the only tracks that manages to balance the more traditionally rooted black metal sound with the newer, more symphonic sound in a way that doesn't sound like shit, but it is a really, really fine balance. It's also kind of shame that this track is a cancel culture song, because past the topic, this is one of the better songs on the album. Neo Spartacus is kind of a mess. I do really like some of the elements at play here, really enjoying the bass work. The mix is also very solid and punchy for that. I'm also really liking a lot of the drum work, but past that, this song sounds very much like a weaker B-side or leftover from The Satanist. It's very overdramatic with too much of a focus on being bouncy and catchy, so with that blend, this whole song just comes across as a kind of goofy. Disinheritance has a pretty cool intro. I'm kind of into this more melodic thing that they're going for here, but again, it ends up running into this kind of second wave black metal sound that they don't really own all that well. And it is one of the better songs here, but there's some change-ups here that are kind of awkward and many points where the song feels like it should have been over already. Past this point in the album, there is a few tracks that have a noticeable spike in quality, starting with Off to War. This track is one of those songs that really owns its connection with the bigger songs from The Satanist. It sounds pretty good. It's not groundbreaking by default, but it is a better track for sure. Once Upon a Pale Horse might be my favorite track here. It is very well put together from front to back. I'm a big fan of these chugging, marching parts that lead into these very fast, rapid-fire guitar parts. And it's got some good mojo. It's not the most impressive work technically, but it's a good song, and the solo rips pretty hard. Thy Becoming Eternal definitely steps back a bit into that blast beat heavy style, which for the most part works here. I'm not really sure how I feel about the backing vocals with these very weird chanting bits that are kind of neat. But I think that's kind of the last good moment on the album, as the record finishes with Versus Christus, which is just kind of a total fumble in my opinion. Oh Nurgle, please tell me how much you hate Christianity again. It's not overdone or tired at all. This track wants to be very profound, but what it ends up being is deeply unsatisfying because they decided to put this nearly 6.5 minute long slog at the end of this record. Anyway, there is stuff to like here. There's also some kind of bad stuff too. It's not like you shouldn't check this album out, but in my opinion, Behemoth are very clearly over the hill at this point, and if you want to skip this record, by all means, you're not really missing much. Opvs Contra Natvram is a pretty solid 4. Thank you all so much for watching. Please let me know what you thought of this album in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.